I always begin by saying when we talk about interreligious dialogue, there are two hands here, and this often leads to conflict and misunderstanding. Now, one hand is to understand how it was formulated in the context of the document Nostra Aetate, the relation of the church to other religions, read in the context of ecumenical dialogue, communio, fellowship, communion, degrees of communion among all believers, as there are greater degrees of communion through baptism among Christians, to the understanding of the church as a communion in the document on the church. Or you could look at dialogue in terms of the other document of the Secretariat that produced these, religious liberty, and in public engagement, dialogue in the public square, the church's engagement with the world, and then Gaudium et Spes, the church in the modern world. Well, public dialogue and interreligious dialogue for spiritual companionship and mutual responsibility in being people of faith, and on the other hand, interreligious dialogue for engagement in public issues are often two different exercises. And we were often doing this when we looked at situations during those years in the 90s of the Balkans, the Middle East, and Sudan. Those are three that came to mind there. With the Balkans, we first of all needed the religious factor to understand the long history of what was unfolding and how Yugoslavia and the communist era had kept the lid on so much disagreement and hostility and diversity. The history there needed to unfold. The larger context was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And that was causing ecumenical dialogues, which had been progressing between Orthodoxy and Latin Catholicism at a certain pace, caused those to be set back and to be reformulated as Eastern Catholics came out of the underground and wanted their roles back in society. And so we were going through a whole shift of trying to understand the role of religion in terms of statecraft here. And really, I think one of the breakthroughs was when we were able to encourage, and on their own through all kinds of international help, local leaders, especially in Bosnia, to begin forming committees, interreligious committees, and working together. There we began, and it was rocky at first, but you had very strong support on the Catholic side coming from John Paul II, who made interreligious dialogue part of his agenda. Maybe in his own sort of centralizing way and papal way, he took too much leadership in interreligious dialogue, but no one seemed to mind when he would call religious leaders together from the Balkans in the snows of January 1993 at Assisi. It's that third Assisi that people don't talk about, the one that involved the representatives of the Balkans praying in Assisi for peace. So that he was an actor. I think the Archbishop of Canterbury, who went to the first Assisi in '86, said perhaps the papacy is the only religious office in the world that could cause such an event to take place and bring people together in one place as he has done, possibly. So we had these, and we talked about Sudan. We needed to know the religious factors there in Sudan. I think you were at the conference for one of those Sudan meetings that Drew had, and trying to understand how Muslims looked at the reforms going on under Tarabi and whether Tarabi was in favor or not in favor, and the Sufi brotherhoods that nobody seemed to talk about. The media, of course, it was always a problem in trying to move ahead with media manipulation of the religious issue, that things were more simply put, well, if you talk to these Muslim representatives from Sudan, then therefore you were on the other side and you were against the rights of Christians in the south of Sudan. And so it's always a difficult way of proceeding and finding a strategy to where you could look at all sides of the issues, but also promote the human rights and promote peace as best we could. I remember with the Middle East in particular, the first Iraq War, and people outside of Washington don't understand this, but religious groups here in Washington very seldom get a window to influence government, very seldom. And it just so happened that at a particular point in the buildup, in what we called the crisis in the Gulf, which would have been the fall of 1990, the bishops met as an administrative body and issued a statement. It would be considered an unjustifiable step towards war to double the American troops in Saudi Arabia. And that night, Bush announced a doubling of troops in Saudi Arabia. The timing could not have been better. Suddenly on Nightline, a bishop was appearing, arguing just war criteria. And if you remember those days, the whole of society was talking just war criteria. It was hard to believe, anyone who went through a kind of Thomistic education, that these categories would be in the public square, but they were. And then Bush said, well, we've all discussed it, and now we know it's a just war. So government immediately manipulated it. So, you know, the influence of religion on government actors is precarious and easily manipulated. And I think that's one of the lessons that we learned. Too often, looking at all of these events that we dealt with over the years, too often interreligious dialogue was envisioned as a strategy for results, and more often than not, it was a way of learning. It was the way that the people involved actually learned. And the benefit of dialogue was in the doing of it rather than what it produced. Very often these final statements had little significance, but the bonding that took place among those engaged in it, then you get into this other hand. People are actually bonding. Yes, people are bonding. In fact, when they start talking about why they are engaged in this, coming from the perspective they begin to talk about some of those deep abiding values that often aren't talked about in public language. But the bonding was often the result. The flexibility, no single model seemed to work for every situation. You always had to be flexible. And in fact, nowadays, I think we've gone through such a change in this. No longer are major national or international dialogues really carrying the energy of interreligious dialogue. At one time they did, because they had the support and they were the ones who felt most equipped to engage in these sorts of dialogues. But I think it's happening now away from national offices, away from church offices. It's happening in all other kinds of institutions. Partially, I think, because there's less and less skill for it in national offices when it comes to churches. We have to think in terms of formation and education. Formation for dialogue we talk about in church circles, religious circles. Education we talked about in the public realm. Youth are being educated in a pluralistic world, in a globalized society, and it's in that context that formation for dialogue can take place. And I think that's really our future. In many ways, it's possible that the global ethic was formulated in another era. It was formulated in an era of the 90s as we were facing these confrontations and using the kind of criteria and the actors we had available to us. I think in a post-9/11 world, we need, and in this globalized society, we need to look again at the mechanics of the global ethic. And if we're going to build a social consensus, which is what is talked about, this is going to happen through formation and people engaged in dialogue. It used to be people enter dialogue coming from a religious tradition to engage in dialogue. Now, people are coming to religion through engagement in dialogue. That's a fact. And I think that's going to determine how we look at the global ethic and what the principles of the global ethic are as they're articulated in the future.